Excuse me, just going to come in sideways here. Sorry, I can't walk in straight. I have to shuffle to the side with these big guns. Oh, hello. Welcome to the show. This is Comic Tropes, and I'm your host, Chris. What if you wanted to make some comic books, but there was no real roadmap telling you how to do it, other than a handful of Superman issues that had sold really well? Now, what if on top of that, you were an angry, vindictive person with violent tendencies, but instead of working on a little scene, independent art project, you were supported at every turn by a mainstream publisher who did nothing to edit or censor you? That is the story of Fletcher Hanks, one of the most bizarre creators to come out of the golden age of comic books, and that's the topic for today, talking about Fletcher Hanks. He's weird, his stories aren't necessarily good, but he is fascinating because, unlike most of his contemporaries, he both wrote and illustrated 100% of his own stories. So before we go any further, please consider hitting like and subscribe. That really helps the channel. Maybe sharing it or leaving a comment. That all helps. Without any further ado, let's talk about Fletcher Hanks. Fletcher Hanks was born in December of 1889. He was born in Paterson, New Jersey, and raised in Oxford, Maryland. As an adult, he worked in Manhattan, so he lived his life within the Northeast. His mother was very lenient with him and gave him whatever he wanted. This included signing him up for cartooning and art classes at age 20. By 1912, Fletcher married Margaret and they had 4 children. But by the time his second oldest was 12 years old, Fletcher had stolen his son's piggy bank money and abandoned the family for good. By his family's accounts, he was a drunkard who abused them all. And according to son Fletcher Jr., Margaret told him that having his money stolen was a small price to pay to be rid of the bum. You need to know this stuff right up front because the kind of person that Fletcher Hanks was is going to color how we interpret the work that we're about to see by him. Now, there's very little biographical information about Fletcher Hanks out there, and what little there is has mostly come from cartoonist and comics historian Paul Karasik and his conversations that he had with Fletcher Hanks Jr. Those can all be found in this amazing book that's published by Fantagraphics. It's called Turn Loose Our Death Rays and Kill Them All, and it's the complete works, at least as far as everybody knows, of Fletcher Hanks. It's a wonderful book that will give you a lot more information on Fletcher Hanks. And so, anyway, with all that out of the way, let's dive into the work of Fletcher Hanks and analyze what he was doing with these ugly yet fascinating comic book stories. Fletcher Hanks' first comic was also the one that he made the most issues of, and was also the last comic that he made before he abruptly disappeared from comics after less than 3 full years working on them. This was Stardust the Super Wizard. It's worth noting that Stardust predates the Billy Batson Captain Marvel character, who had supernaturally gifted abilities. Stardust debuted in issue 1 of Fantastic Comics, cover dated December of 1939. Fantastic Comics was an early title by publisher Fox Features Syndicate, who began publishing in May of 1939. Its founder, Victor Fox, had been an accountant at National Periodicals, which eventually became DC Comics. He was privy to the sales figures for DC's new superhero titles, including Superman, and he quickly started his own publishing company to capitalize on the new subgenre. He contracted with the Eisner and Iger Studios, who would make full comic book stories and sell them to publishers who were looking to break into the then new and rapidly expanding world of comic books. In my episode on comic books about making comic books, I discussed how Will Eisner established his own studio and hired cartoonists who could put together stories they'd in turn sell to other publishers. This was set up like an automobile assembly line, with a writer handing off the story to a penciler, who in turn handed the pages off to an inker, a letterer, a color separator, and so on. The major publishers were using the same system. For instance, Superman was Siegel and Schuster and some assistants. Bob Kane employed Bill Finger and other assistants to make Batman. Stardust, as well as the other creations of Fletcher Hanks, was different. Fletcher did it all himself. When you look at a Stardust story and wonder, how did they come up with this stuff? Well, you're actually wondering, how did this solitary guy come up with all this stuff? Not only did he write, pencil, and ink all of his own stories, scholars who studied his work, like Paul Karasik, suspect Fletcher was lettering and even coloring his own work as well. There's evidence to support this. Some of Fletcher's pages about Big Red McLean, a lumberjack hero, were later reprinted and both recolored and relettered with more even word balloons. And the colors on Stardust definitely have a different feel from the other stories within Fantastic Comics or other work by Eisner and Iger Studios at that time. Fletcher Hanks was an asshole, and his stories were super weird. But you can't accuse him of not being creative. He was an auteur, and by saying auteur, I mean that in the same way that filmmakers like Ed Wood or Tommy Wiseau or Neil Breen are auteurs, as in it's one person's unfiltered ideas going out into the world. When we look at the work of Fletcher Hanks, I can't personally call those stories good, but I can call them engaging. So let's go into his stories a little bit more, and I'll explain what I mean about good. Good is an objective word. You can like something and know that it's objectively not great. The storytelling in Fletcher Hanks' stories is poorly paced. We never really get introduced to an average person who needs to be rescued. There's no viewpoint character. Instead, we usually see some gangsters or mad scientists that are planning on destroying the world. Stardust emerges from space, punishes them, and then the stories just end abruptly. There are pages where Hanks literally seems to have run out of room and will just have a small panel with silhouettes of people saying something like, "There goes Stardust," or "We never even got to thank him." Stardust has no personality to speak of. He just shows up, has no trouble stopping the villain of the story, and leaves. Although he never quite seems to show up early enough to stop a certain amount of destruction. There are recurring threats. The assassination or kidnapping of world leaders happens several times. Sometimes it's a simple set of snipers aiming at the US president, and other times the criminals have vacuum tubes that can suck up people all over the world. Still other times, scientists want to destroy the world, usually for unexplained reasons. There are stories with giant waves, volcanoes, or tornadoes. More infrequent are people that just want to steal money or gold. The villains usually have access to a death ray that has no effect on Stardust. One time they had the horrific-sounding blood-drying needle bombs. Halfway through his run on Stardust, Fletcher Hanks uses alien conquerors that have access to special bombs or gigantic vultures. 3 of the last 5 stories use the ill-defined recurring enemies called the Fifth Column, who seem to have similar motivations to the earlier stories using gangsters, where they just want to undermine society. Even though World War II was going on at this time, there are not any easily identified Nazis or spy saboteurs working for Axis powers. The Fifth Column is the closest these stories get to villains like that. Unlike Superman with Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, Perry White, Ma Kent, Stardust has no supporting cast to speak of. He has only his own machines which tell him when a crime is taking place, and he has no sidekick or love interest. One of the later stories does have him rescue a lady after her home is destroyed and her parents are killed, and he lets her come and stay on his asteroid in space, but he really doesn't seem interested in her. And to be fair, we don't understand her motivations very well either. Most people in a situation like this might need at least a few minutes to grieve the loss of their home and family, but she seems to be up for whatever is easiest, including living in space, basically alone. Stardust himself is more like a force than a person. His stories are real Old Testament wrath of God stuff. The stories all feature a crime or attack of some kind, and Stardust just flies in and punishes the guilty. Most of Fletcher Hanks' stories are about punishing the guilty, never really about protecting the innocent. And wow, does Stardust have a lot of powers. Almost all of these powers are explained in narration boxes as being a type of ray. I know he's called Stardust the Super Wizard, but there's nothing supernatural about his stories. Stardust has science-based powers that let him shoot all sorts of amazing rays. And there's no better way to share how many abilities he has than to literally list them. Stardust has an anti-gravity ray to make things go in any direction that he wants. He has a boomerang ray that causes machines to backfire on the user. He has a magnetic ray to draw things towards him. He has a suspension ray to make people float in midair, and he has the ability to teleport people. And all of those are just powers that he uses in his very first story. Moving forward, we learn Stardust can also turn invisible, which he never needs to do, but I guess it helps terrify the criminals that he's abusing. He has a crime-detecting phone, a disintegration ray to completely annihilate things, and can make words appear in lights in the sky. God forbid Stardust actually sit down and talk with someone like a human being. His most confusing powers show up in his fifth appearance, where he has something called a rarefying beam and a transport ray. More comprehensible is his reduction ray, which he can use to shrink people. Future stories show that Stardust has an absorbing ray to reduce something's power, and a solar fusing ray to melt things. We're told that he has something called extra sight, which sounds like long distance vision. And you might think that his anti-gravity ray or suspension ray were plenty of ways to control things, but he also has an anti-motion ray to make things just stop. Stardust can also leave behind dust that is acid-proof. Of all the ways dust could factor into Stardust's name, I have to admit that acid-blocking dust was pretty far down on the list. He has something called a retarding ray, which might sound like his anti-motion ray, but it is called something different, so honestly, who knows? And he has extinguishing rays. Stardust uses fusing rays next, which is probably the same thing as his solar fusing ray. He also has mental powers that allow him to control other people. In issue 14 of Fantastic Comics, Stardust suddenly grants a bunch of kids his same powers. And in issue 16, he transforms his hand. This is not Fletcher Hanks drawing a hand badly. Stardust actually transforms his hand into something more akin to tentacles. This, despite the fact that Stardust has been shown to easily grip criminals around the waist and torso with no trouble. Finally, in his last story, which shows up in Big 3 Comics number 2 from winter of 1941, Stardust reveals his best power, a transform ray. He uses this to shrink the villain's body until he's mostly just a head. Stardust also has super strength, of course, in case that wasn't obvious, and he hurls the villain's head through space, with the now petulant villain screaming for mercy. The head lands on an alien planet full of headless creatures. They slowly absorb and kill the villain, wordlessly ignoring his pleas for help. If there is a theme to Fletcher Hanks' work, it's definitely all about punishment. The stories are all in service of that theme. There will be the briefest of setups showing somebody committing a crime. Stardust shows up out of nowhere and punishes them cruelly and swiftly. And then it seems like Fletcher Hanks loses all interest in where the story is going and ends things very abruptly. What drives Stardust to punish people? He isn't out to protect the innocent or get revenge. Stardust doesn't have the motivations of Superman or Batman or Spider-Man. It's part of what keeps Fletcher Hanks' work so mystifying. Things just happen without motivation. In Stardust's fourth story, he takes a criminal to jail in space. Does Stardust run this jail? Why jail in space? He freezes the criminal of the story in outer space, but Stardust is not consistent in how he punishes villains. He kills some of them. Others he treats with more existentialist horrors, like abandoning a villain on Mars after the villain killed every Martian. The villain has to live amongst the corpses. Another villain that was trying to steal wealth is taken to a planet of gold and diamonds. Stardust explains the environment is so healthy, the criminal will live almost forever, alone with wealth that can't be used. Clearly, one of Fletcher Hanks' biggest fears must be the idea of living for a long time all alone. And still other times, Stardust just perverts nature to be someone's brutal end, like transforming someone into a worm for giant birds. He also turns criminals into literal rats at one point. And in another story, he throws a villain to a very strange-looking octopus to be eaten. Since the stories themselves don't really make any sense, they instead work on a meta level where we, the reader, understand we're getting a glimpse into the creator's head. Fletcher Hanks doesn't care about telling a good story. He cares about showing us how he wants to hurt those he feels deserves it. And those that deserve it are always world conquerors or villains trying to obtain massive amounts of wealth. The Golden Age is full of weird ideas that were quickly churned out to see what clicked. In that regard, Fletcher Hanks would likely be forgotten since he didn't work in the industry for much more than 2 years, and he used aliases for all his other work aside from Stardust. But Art Spiegelman came across Fantastic Comics number 7, featuring a Stardust story where everyone was tossed into space by a villain that turned off gravity. It's an absurd premise, but the visual of everyone on Earth being flung out into space was striking. Spiegelman reprinted the story, which was in the public domain, in his underground comics magazine Raw issue number 5 from 1983 that he co-published along with his wife, Françoise Mouly. Paul Karasik worked on the magazine, and he became the person who would hunt down almost everything we know today about Hanks. There's no known photos of Fletcher Hanks, but his son told Karasik that this background character from Fantastic Comics number 5 was a self-portrait. The shot is of a group of FBI agents. Is this how Hanks saw himself? Part of a group of heroes, the FBI? Is he a cool guy smoking a cigarette and wearing a nice outfit? It's worth mulling over. But regardless, while everything kind of can look ugly, the visuals are an important part of the appeal of Fletcher Hanks. It's ugly, but it's unlike anything else. And there is talent underneath all that ugliness. Hanks was well regarded by his cartoonist teachers and obviously was talented enough to obtain work for Eisner and Iger. His work stands out and it's identifiable. So many of his villains feature a similar ugly face, a jutting underbite, massively furrowed brow, almost always at the same angle. I think there's a good chance he was inspired by the Dick Tracy villains that Chester Gould had been illustrating in newspapers for 8 years before Hanks started making comics. Fletcher Hanks' panel layout is a weird mess. It loosely follows the traditional Z pattern of American comics, but he used larger and smaller panels such that it wasn't always immediately obvious which one to read next. At least at first. Hanks improved. While early stories need to wrap themselves up quickly in some very tiny panels, by the end of his run in comics, Hanks was using a more standardized grid, which gave the story room to breathe. He also started his work with delicate hatching to indicate textures, but he learned that printing techniques of the day and being placed on cheap newsprint often blurred and obscured those lines. So, by the end of his work, he's using much thicker brush strokes and using thicker blacks for shadows. Hanks was a serious artist at one point. Early stories like this one, Taboo, Wizard of the Jungle, didn't take off, but feature much more elaborate backgrounds than most early Golden Age comics. And he seemed to enjoy drawing exotic environments more than the comparatively dull cities most superhero stories would take place in. His city scenes are bland rooms, but Stardust's headquarters is full of incomprehensible and surreal equipment. Fletcher Hanks liked to go to alien planets or tell stories set in a faraway jungle like those of Phantoma. Phantoma warrants plenty of attention herself because she was the first female character in comics to exhibit superpowers. She debuted in Jungle Comics #2 from February of 1940. Wonder Woman didn't debut until October of 1941. So while Phantoma is obviously not the most popular female superhero, it's worth noting she was the first. Almost everything I said about Stardust applies to Phantoma. She has no supporting cast, friends, or motivation. In fact, it isn't even clear what Phantoma is. Is she a spirit of vengeance? A witch? An alien? It's never addressed. She also emerges once a criminal activity is taking place, but for her, it's always specifically happening in the jungle. Just like Stardust, Phantoma has a seemingly endless supply of super abilities and just shows up to punish the guilty and then disappear. But she also has the strange ability to turn from a beautiful blonde into a skull-faced horror. If anything, Phantoma's punishments are even more extreme. While her first story just has her standing by as a thief drowns in quicksand, by the third story, she's turning angry gorillas against the villain, who literally tear him limb from limb. Grisly! Sometimes she traps people on asteroids or underground, but then other times she tosses villains to jungle cats or crocodiles. Phantoma's stories really push the violence. Armies of tiger women are said to kill the babies of innocent villagers. Phantoma sends them into space. Others she has die by their own creations, like chemical-based evil hands or being forced to fly into a killer tsunami. Fletcher Hanks had a brief career, but he told a lot of stories in that time. Beyond the Phantoma and Stardust stories, he told 9 stories about Big Red McLean, a lumberjack, and 7 about Space Smith, who was basically Flash Gordon or Buck Rogers. So he told a lot of different stories in a brief amount of time. And then all of a sudden he disappeared from comics, and there's no official word why. There's a rumor that he ended up marrying a fairly wealthy woman, and he no longer needed to work, but we'll never know for sure. All we know is that he was estranged from his family, and he was next found dead at age 75. He was frozen to death on a park bench in Manhattan, probably drunk, probably homeless. It's a really sad ending. This guy lived a life full of horrors. He was abusive, he basically died violently, and yet those feelings that he must have been going through all the time that led him to live that kind of life are really baked into his comics. So this is some dark, weird stuff that you're really getting a unfiltered view of somebody's mind in. Yeah, not a happy life, but it does explain where the anger and violence in his stories come from. If you want to learn more, my strongest recommendation is this book. Again, it's The Complete Works of Fletcher Hanks, published by Fantagraphics. Has a lot of biographical information by Paul Karasik, and every story. It's reprinted in nice bright colors on good paper, not like digitally touched up or anything, just nice clean scans. It's a lot of crazy bizarre reading. It's really entertaining. Anyway, gets my recommendation. Thank you so much for watching, and until I see you next time, keep reading comics. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please consider hitting like and subscribe. If you'd like to support the show, there are merchandise links beneath the YouTube video, and you can always hit join on YouTube or visit Comic Tropes on Patreon to get access to special perks.